Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It is an honour to stand and give my first speech in this chamber as the new Member of Parliament for Bournemouth West, which should in fact be more accurately called Bournemouth West and Poole East, because the new constituency of Bournemouth West includes wards from my honourable friend, the member for Poole, and also the honourable lady, the member for Mid Dorset and North Poole. I thank also, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Speaker for giving me this opportunity this evening in what is, I understand, a slight breach of the conventions of this House to deliver a maiden speech in an adjournment debate. I'm standing, I understand, in the same place that another new member breached convention some 50 years ago when Margaret Thatcher delivered her maiden speech as a private bill introduction. I have to say that I told her on Saturday that I was going to be doing my maiden, and I waited 50 days, and she told me it was over time to get on with it. My team, in researching this speech, found that Lady Thatcher, in fact, waited over 100 days, which I shall point out to her on the next occasion that I see her. I will, if I may, Mr. Deputy Speaker, just say a word in opening about my predecessor, Sir John Butterfield, who served this House for 27 years, and in that time introduced 4 private bills into law, which must be, I imagine, something of a record. He introduced the Registered Homes Amendment Act, the Insolvency Act, the Policyholders Protection Act, and the Building Societies Funding and Financial Mutuals Arrangement Act. Sir John, I hope, in the months and years that lie ahead, will have time to reflect in a very good way on the totality of his 27 years of service in this place, and not just on the difficult period in the run-up to the last general election. I suspect it must also be unusual for a new member who represents a constituency that has only ever had 4 members of Parliament to be able to pay tribute not just to my predecessor, but to my predecessor's predecessor, Lord Eden of Winton, who in fact joined me with Bournemouth's young member of the Youth Parliament, Jasmine Osborne, on the campaign trail in Bournemouth at the last general election. And Lord Eden has now served for 27 years in the other place. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I bring to the House today the subject of Britain's English language schools and the enormous contribution that they make to the economy of the United Kingdom. More than 500 students a year choose to learn English in Britain, and that accounts for almost 43% of all students who choose to travel abroad to learn English. It is estimated that they contribute over £1.5 billion to the United Kingdom economy every year. And it is appropriate, I suspect, that we talk about this in the context of the budget that my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, introduced earlier this week, when we're talking about diversifying the UK economy away from a sole reliance on the financial services sector. This is a massive export for our country and a contributor to the bottom line. And Bournemouth has, I suspect, more language schools per head of population than almost anywhere else in the country. But of course, it's not just Bournemouth that has this. I see in his place my honourable friend, the member for Cambridge, who I know wanted to intervene in this debate, but the chair is of the view that we shouldn't breach that convention. I know that they're very important in Cambridge too, as well as in Poole and Brighton, and I see my honourable friend, the member for Grantham and Stamford, who is hoping to make a brief contribution to this debate. Why are we talking about this, and why is this now a problem? It is a problem because of what the last government did in the dying months of office. Immigration became a rising political topic as we got closer to the general election, and the last government, in an attempt to be seen to be doing something, did the old civil service, the old Sir Humphrey, we must do something, this is something, therefore let's do it. And they changed the criteria on the requirement for English language, the competence you needed to have in English to come to Britain to study English. And they also changed the student visa arrangements so that you had to return to your country of origin to extend your visa. Now, it's not just the question of the English language schools themselves and the employment that they generate within Bournemouth and Poole that I want to draw attention to. It's the very welcome additional earnings into the household budget that the host families who welcome these students into their home get. It's the boost to the local economy when their family and friends come to visit and stay in local hotels and use local restaurants. It's estimated, the Professor Fletcher of Bournemouth University has estimated that they contribute over £200 million to the local economy in the Bournemouth and Poole area. And then there's the bit that you can't actually probably quantify. and that is that those who have come to Britain to learn English have a great affection and affinity for Britain, which will stand our country in great stead in the years ahead when they return and enter businesses, and in some cases, the Right Honourable Lord King visited me during the election campaign and was relaying the story of an Egyptian defence minister who, on his first night in Brisbane on a visit, didn't want to go out to dinner with the Secretary of State for Defence because he wanted to go and see his old landlady, who he had great affection for. And that is something that we can't put a price to, but it's an enormous benefit. The last government were right to recognise that there was a problem with some bogus schools, and they put these measures in place to try and deal with it. Prior to the introduction of the points-based system, it was estimated that up to 50,000 students could be using the student visa system as a way of staying in the United Kingdom illegally. They introduced the new system in April 2009, which forced the schools to gain government accreditation. And that saw the closure of several thousand bogus language schools. So great strides were made in tightening up the system. On the 12th of November 2009, only months after the system was put in place, the former Prime Minister ordered a review into the system, which was due to concerns about those coming in to study at below degree level. And that came forward with the member for Oldham East said about that, "I would like to make it absolutely clear," this was on the 11th of December 2009, "that no firm decisions as to whether and what changes ought to be made to Tier 4 have yet to be taken. The responses we have received from all parts of the education sector have suggested there is potential for some of the broader review questions to affect the UK's attractiveness as a destination for study if they are implemented. Damaging the education sector is not the aim of the review." But the reality is that the outcome of the review has done just that. Let's look a little bit, if we may, in detail about what this change to the English language requirement has done. And I want to quote, if I may, a letter from my right honourable and noble friend, Lord Eden, who poses the simple question. This was to my right honourable friend, the Minister for Immigration, on the 20th of May this year. "The simple question that needs to be answered is how are students that are coming to this country to learn English supposed to be able to qualify in English language proficiency in order to receive a student visa?" Now, we're not talking about a very, very basic understanding of English here. The definition of B1 competence, which is the equivalent of about an A-star GCSE, says, "can understand the main points of clear standard input on familiar matters regularly encountered in work, school, leisure, etc. Can deal with most situations likely to arise whilst travelling in an area where the language is spoken, can produce simple connected text on topics which are frequent or familiar or of personal interest, can describe experiences and events, dreams, hopes and ambitions, and briefly give reasons and explanations, opinions and plans." Now, it sounds to me that if you're able to do all of that, that sounds like you're pretty fluent and wouldn't necessarily need to enrol yourself on an English language course. So we are actually talking about saying to students, learn English to come to qualify to study and learn English in Britain. It is painfully ridiculous. The other point that the problems arise for the language schools is in their dealings with the UK Border Agency, where the institutions and students have found the UK Border Agency have been difficult to communicate with. One student trying to negotiate the application process said, quote, "They found the UK staff provide conflicting information or are unable to answer queries regarding classification of guidance, which does more than simply repeat the existing regulations." I think honourable members in this House might recognise some of that in another organisation that we've had dealings with in recent weeks closer to home, but I won't derail myself by going into that point. The UK Border Agency failed to carry out any impact assessments prior to the implementation of its changes, which was extremely damaging indeed. The UK Border Agency, under pressure from the flawed system that they had in April 2009, were obviously anxious to be seen to be robust and proactive. But this meant that there was increasing frustration on the part of the English language schools who are responsible now under the licensing arrangements for the whereabouts of their students. One college in Bournemouth, Anglo Continental, led by Guido Schilling, it's a school that's been there, I think, since the 1930s, related an example where he is responsible for the whereabouts of his student, yet the UK Border Agency would not tell him, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of the whereabouts of whether this person, the student, had actually arrived in the United Kingdom at all. It's a grossly unfair situation indeed. When we, my right honourable friend, the Minister for Immigration, did in fact meet with a delegation of local language schools. My honourable friend, the member for Poole, will probably be able to enlighten the House if he seeks to contribute to this debate in a few moments' time. But he said of the changes that they've made on the English language front, that what the last government were doing was using a sledgehammer, not simply using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but using a sledgehammer to smash entirely the wrong object altogether. There is also the point here about the numbers of students who come to the United Kingdom who learn the English language in these courses and then progress into higher education, which is a very, very fundamental point indeed. In my own constituency of Bournemouth West, I now have the whole of Bournemouth University rated by the Guardian. I will give the Guardian credence on this one, in a way I wouldn't normally, as Britain's #1 new university. They have a regular flow of new students coming in from Bournemouth's language schools and moving on to degree-level qualification once they've reached the qualification at the language schools. One thing that I hope my honourable friend, the Minister, the member for Old Bexley and Sidcup, will acknowledge in his response is that we are not operating in a vacuum here. There is global competition for language schools. There's obviously you can go to New Zealand, you can go to Canada. If you want to learn to speak English badly, you go to America. We are not operating in a total vacuum here. And the relationship between the agents who place the students and the schools themselves is the principal relationship. And those agents are now looking at the difficulty facing students who come to this country and are already exploring relationships with other language schools in other parts of the world. And if we see those relationships severed, we will have inflicted a terrible and grievous wound on the UK's English language school sector. It's also, I think, the Minister may, I hope the Home Office will continue to review these changes that were implemented by the last government. There is also much that we can, in fact, look at from other countries and how they handle things. So in sort of coming to a conclusion on this, I'm not just standing here to complain about what the last government did, because that is futile. We now, in the coalition, have an opportunity to review much of what the last government did and come to other solutions. There is the opportunity, for example, that we could move to a bond system, which I know my right honourable friend, the member for Ashford, looked at prior to the election, where the student would pay an upfront sum of money, which would make their disappearance and absconsion much less likely. We could have an assessment level where we could look also at the risks posed by students from particular risk countries, and we could have a classification where we could perhaps relax the rules for others. I just in conclusion say this, that the changes made by the last government are having a profoundly worrying and detrimental effect on real businesses in my constituency and throughout the country. And I hope that the Minister will look at all the alternatives, because this is a sector that we can be proud of. Our English language is one of the greatest assets we have as a country. English is the language of world commerce. And if we shut off the ability of these schools to thrive and to welcome people to our shores, to immerse themselves in our language and our culture and our values, we will look back and realise in time that we have made a very fundamental mistake indeed. Yeah.